Hello and welcome to another session of Karen's Colours. I'm Dr. Karen, and today we're in for another look at the things that most people miss when they think about colour analysis. This is part 2 of the series, and our topic for today is the driver or the destination, and we're looking at the colours green and yellow. I'd like to welcome those of you who have been here before and been following this series. It certainly isn't an easy one to take on because there are lots of concepts here that you've probably never even considered before. And if you're new here, I strongly advise that you go back and have a look at part 1. It explains the basics of where we're coming from so that you can understand where we're heading now and into the future. Anyway, let's get started. To recap from part 1, we know that humans are programmed to see colour and to take notice, that colour gives information about objects, situations, and also about people. All colours have both positive and negative connotations, and the recognition of colours is caused through the development of basic colour terms. And those form in a particular order. And it's that order that we'll be examining these colours as we go through this series on what most people miss about colour analysis. Black and white are considered to be the basic colours, and red derives from highly emotive experiences. And for that, again, I'd advise you to go back to see the previous video. I'll leave a link to that in the notes below. The next BCTs to be looked at are yellow and green, which can occur in either order, but both must be present before the language will allow us to recognise another colour in that list of basic colour terms. But why green and yellow specifically? What, in fact, do they signify? And that's what we'll be looking at in this session. But before we continue, I'd like you just to look at this picture for a few moments. Now, it's a lounge room and it is made in the colours yellow and green. Are you likely to ever choose these colours to decorate your lounge area? And if so, please consider why that might be the case. For myself, I find this particular combination extremely tiring to look at, and I doubt very much if I could ever live in a room that looked like this. But somebody did, and somebody thought it was great. Why would that be? Well, let's explore, shall we? Now, because the colours yellow and green arose in language such a long time ago, we really don't know what prompted those colours to be important. So what I've assembled here is a conjectural social history of why it's likely that these two colours have developed some form of importance. Let's have a look at how we observe green to begin with. It may not necessarily have been the first colour of the two to be incorporated into a language, but we'll assume for the purposes of this session that it was. Green represents natural cycles of new to old, that is, birth, maturity, death, and then rebirth. It also links to foliage, which it allows us to have hiding places. It is thought that people in very early stages of their development lived in forested areas, partially because that's where their fruit and food came from, but also because they offered hiding places. Plants tend to attract animals, and animals can be hunted and therefore become food. So green became associated with survival skills. If we now observe what happened with yellow, well, yellow is associated with ripeness, but it's also associated with the colour red. And interestingly, in those languages where yellow had not yet been developed, yellow and red were considered to be synonymous. Again, you'd have to go back to the previous video to look at what red meant, but red was associated with ripeness just like yellow is. There is also a link between yellow and green. Yellow associates with dead and dying plants. either as a result of age or of disease processes. And it's also a very highly favoured colour for decoration. The Australian Aboriginal person still at corroboree time will choose yellow ochre as one of the decorative elements for their ceremonies. But yellow is also linked to risk-taking. And so we learned to recognize that yellow plants, yellow animals, yellow reptiles, yellow insects even, all of these things have the potential for great danger for human beings, either death or injury, and often both. Both yellow and green then associate with knowledge and with the experience with the environment and survival practices. There is, however, a need also for behavioural change when we notice both green and yellow occurring in the environment. Fire is both red and yellow, and it's another survival tactic. Fire stick farming was one of the practices of early humans in which they destroyed old vegetation in order to encourage the birth of new vegetation, which in turn tended to attract animals which were then used for food. But fire was also considered to be a sacred object, and so was therefore carefully tended and nurtured and carried from one place to another. The conclusion we can draw from these conjectural histories is that green harms but doesn't necessarily destroy, whereas yellow excites but is also potentially harmful. Now, this history has developed into some contemporary symbolism. Firstly, it's a political system. Green is all about environmentalism, and in fact, the term greenie has become quite a pejorative in modern political discourse. Yellow, on the other hand, is all about inferiority. It's linked to the symbols of cowardice and is also a pejorative. So in this case, both yellow and green are not considered to be favourable colours from a political perspective. On the other hand, tribute gives us a slightly different view. Green is associated with a harvest and gifts to gods, and this is regardless of the particular culture from which it arose. African or South American or Asian practices are all associated with harvest festivals in which a great deal of green and yellow harvested goods were offered to the gods. But yellow is also associated with vassal gifts to conquerors, and these have been recorded in stelae, in parchments, and also in symbolic drawings, where persons with a great deal of yellow material, mainly gold and other precious items, would hand these over or offer them as some sort of supplication to either a conqueror or to someone of great importance. We call this tribute. But tribute these days is more a symbolic association and has been disconnected from the idea of green and yellow. Nevertheless, green and yellow still serve a purpose in our society for signalling. Green is also associated with release. That is, traffic lights allow us to go ahead, and it also is a form of exchange in terms of money. It represents life, therefore an oasis, which signals that water is present, which is also a life-saving commodity that humans require, and it has links with harvests and yellow. Yellow, on the other hand, is often associated with fortune, and it requires people to reconsider their action, but it's also associated with wealth in the form of gold. Yellow is often associated with accidental discoveries and with experimentation and with prosperity. Let's have a look at these in a little more detail in terms of how they influence human behaviour. Green as a concept allows what exists to dominate. Near enough is considered to be good enough. It doesn't matter what you are planting, just as long as some greenery exists in the world in order to create photosynthesis, which in turn gives us food, but also supplies us with oxygen. There is a limited tolerance for the dramatic with people who prefer green as a colour. Such people are often eager for novelty, but that novelty is very short-lived. They readily forgive other people's failings, but there is also a tendency towards forgetfulness, and this derives often from parental criticism, which then leads into them becoming critical of other people. So to summarize, green symbolizes harmony and safety and growth and health. Its effects on human beings is that it has a tendency to revitalize, it balances out humors, it relaxes people, and it encourages them to try again. So we have some positive connotations: generosity, hope, prosperity, and luck, but there are always negative ones, and in this case they are judgmentalism, envy, materialism, and inexperience. What then about yellow? Yellow tends to experiment with whatever exists in the environment. The person who prefers yellow learns by doing things. There is an unlimited tolerance for discovery and exploration, and yellow thinkers tend to need to define characteristics of things. They are associated with optimism, and this derives from a parental encouragement for them to take calculated risks. This then leads to a number of characteristics. Firstly, yellow symbolizes happiness and optimism and positivity and intellect, and its effects on humans is that it clarifies thinking, it inspires, it amuses, and it also energizes. Positive characteristics are creativity, perception, mentality, and warmth, and the negative ones are all about cowardice, deception, egotism, and caution. But what happens when we put those two sets of characteristics together? If we have yellow over green, that is, yellow worn closest to the face and green further down the body, then the characteristics here can be divided into positive or negative, as happens with all situations. The positive idea is that green is a need for growth, for freedom, and for escape from what is. Yellow, on the other hand, allows for the developing of new ideas, testing theories, and accumulating wealth. The negative aspect of this particular combination in this order is that green feels regret, recrimination, and remorse, jealousy, and yellow fosters excuses, feigned joy, and also betrayal. And we see this as a characteristic, as an archetype that we can call the venture capitalist. On the other hand, if we reverse those colors and put green on top of yellow, again, we have positive and negative characteristics. The positive aspect is that yellow, as the driver, is inquisitive, optimistic, and has a desire to experiment. Whereas the green in the real world then becomes opportunities that are grasped and risks that are calculated. The negative aspects of this combination is feelings of fear and anxiety, uncertainty and discomfort, and the green in the real world allows for dishonesty, denial of liability, and accusatory activities. This archetype we can call the gambler. But we can also mix those two colours together, and when they are intertwined throughout the person's personality, then again there are positive and negative aspects, but neither of these is particularly dominant in terms of whether yellow or green are the colours to be considered. The positive aspect of the mixed green-yellow personality is the person who can be the archetype of the environmental scientist. They could be a humanitarian, and they are often very ethical and vigilant. On the other hand, the negative archetype is the deceptive opportunist, who is often a materialistic thrifter and is quite greedy and egotistical. So how do we see this play out in reality? Green, interestingly enough, has an equal favour amongst men and women. It's fairly low because green is not a very popular colour for most people, but it certainly has very little sexual differentiation. It also links to the military and to financial power. It is often considered to be open, friendly, and authentic. And we have a classic example of an archetype associated with green, and that is Robin Hood, the person who robs from the rich to give to the poor, someone who is very humanitarian in their approach to life. Yellow, on the other hand, is favoured more by men than by women. 57% of men, as opposed to 35% of women, will take on yellow as a colour that is desired. It produces visual challenges and can actually tire the eyes and therefore also the mind. It's independent, it offers strategy, and it's also impulsive in what it encourages humans to do. But there are no archetypal examples of yellow that I was able to find. The closest I came to was the yellow brick road, which occurs as an object rather than a human. So it's not really archetypal, but it does lead us somewhere new. Interestingly enough, it leads to a green country. But there is an example I discovered years ago when living in a small country town, smaller than this one, where the local newspaper, yes, we still had them in those days, was run by a man who had been in the town and was well respected for many, many decades. He'd hired a young receptionist, and in speaking with her one day, she complained that every time someone came in to ask about something, they would not ask her, but would rather demand to see the proprietor. And he was becoming rather frustrated with her because many of the questions they were asking, she should be able to answer. So I asked her to try an experiment, to put on a yellow scarf or a yellow top and see what happened. I met her a few months later, and she said that she'd stopped wearing yellow, primarily because when she wore it, people would not only ask her questions, but also ask her questions that she couldn't answer, which made her feel foolish. But worse than that, she found herself with these people continually engaging in conversation that kept her from the work she was expected to do. It's an interesting object lesson for those who like the colour yellow, because they do tend to talk a lot about all sorts of things. So let's give ourselves a little bit of an experiment. If we look at those three archetypical combinations of yellow and green, which would you consider to be the most persuasive, or the most honest, or the most believable? Think about it, make your choices, and if you like, put a comment below to tell me so we can discuss it. But there's also a challenge here. Observe who wears green and yellow in the environment. See what happens over the next week. What behaviours do you see them engaging in? And how do you act if and when you wear those colours? So that brings us back to the question you asked right at the beginning. And the answer is that actions are visible and they affect other people. Motivations, on the other hand, are hidden and private. So whether or not a person wears green or yellow as a dominant colour close to their face or as a colour close to the bottom of their bodies, it has an influence on the way in which we perceive them. But both the motivations and the actions can be deduced not just by observation, but through a colour analysis. We're going to come up with some more colours next time round. We'll be looking at how one becomes a human being as associated to simply a surviving mechanism. And the colours for that are blue and brown. They are the organisers and the innovators. After that, we'll be looking at some civilizing influences, which are associated with the colours orange, grey, purple, and pink. And this is all about participation and citizenship. And then finally, we're going to go into the realms of the future, where we're looking at the next color that is likely to be added to our basic color term lexicon, and that is the color cyan. Does it represent peaceful coexistence? And if so, it's probably not before time. I hope you've enjoyed this session, and certainly I'm very much hoping that you'll engage in conversation in the sections below. But do come back next time and let's see what else you can learn about color analysis. Until then, may the colors of your life lead you where you need to go and bring you the happiness and prosperity that you desire. See you later. Bye.